Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this Humanities seminar, Art in Action, Emerging Technologies, Cybersecurity, and Social Justice. My name is Pamela Sweat, and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. Along with my duties as Dean, I'm also a historian specializing in the social and cultural history of modern Europe, especially Germany in the early 20th century. In the Faculty of Humanities, we explore human culture in many different ways. Our faculty, staff, and students can be found in art studios, experimental labs, in archives and libraries, around conference tables, and off campus, engaged in a variety of community-engaged activities. We have about 115 full-time faculty in a number of different disciplines, as varied as music cognition, philosophy, communications management, and French, and many more. At McMaster, we believe that the humanities has a critical role to play in understanding ourselves and the wider world, and in confronting the great challenges of our day. We also believe in lifelong learning and the importance of strengthening the relationship between the university and our neighbors near and far. And that's why we put on events like this one. I'm thrilled to share tonight the fascinating research of my colleagues who join us for our discussion of how art meets action. Let's get started. I'd like to first introduce our two panelists. Carmela Laganse is an associate professor and teaches in the School of the Arts. Her practice engages with intersections of embodied experience and perception, as well as explores the agency embedded in objects and environments. Her work explores the impact of colonialism, diasporic communities, and considers how these things contribute to material culture and identity. Working in a variety of media, she often builds interactive work or portable modular environments that playfully and critically integrate physical, emotional, ritualistic, and intellectual processes through an intersectional lens. And our second panelist is Andrea Zeffiro. Dr. Zeffiro is an associate professor in communication studies and media art and academic director for the Lewis and Ruth Sherman Center for Digital Scholarship. Her areas of research and teaching include critical data studies, critical cybersecurity studies, data justice, and qualitative digital research methods. Her work on immersive mobile experiences, responsive installations, and virtual and augmented reality has appeared in academic journals, edited collections, and exhibited at the Banff New Media Institute, the California Nanosystems Institute, and in public spaces in New York, Toronto, and Montreal. So I want to begin by inviting each of our panelists to provide some further information about their work. Carmela, why don't you start us off?
Sure, thanks, Pamela. Let's go ahead and share this. And, oops. Okay, can everyone see it? Great.
Looks good.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure again to be here with Andrea, Pamela, and to all of you out there. Thanks to Nina for coordinating this event and webinar, and Dave for taking care of the back end to make sure everything goes smoothly. So as mentioned, I'm a professor in the School of the Arts, where I teach all levels of studio art and practice, primarily in 3D sculpture. I'm also a practicing and exhibiting artist, and my research includes works through sculpture that explores underlying ideologies in popular and material and visual culture through an intersectional lens. So I've been really immersed in a SSHRC-funded project called the Sari-Sari Xchange. So I'll be speaking specifically about the research project in the next few minutes here. So some of the context that we think through in terms of the project is the idea of data sovereignty. So how do we think through the impact of emergent and digital media, such as digital security, AI, environmental, social, and economic impacts through an interdisciplinary approach, as Indigenous communities have and continue to do? Our practice in research creation considers how we coexist with emergent media and everything implicated. So the SSX project, I'll just abbreviate it, reflects the collaborative partnership between Tangled Art and Disability, Real Asian Toronto International Film Festival, and Center 3 for for Artistic and Social Practice, as well as York and McMaster universities. So as a collective, we undertake the exploration in emergent XR technologies and media, as well as storytelling techniques to address underrepresentation and issues of systemic racism, as well as accessibility of these new technologies for both creators and users. So the research project is pretty vast, but we focus on outreach, collaborative practice, learning, and exchange, as well as the code, and to support that, the co-development of and design of a digital platform and mobile studio. In addition, we also facilitate artists, creators, and students through an artist in residency and exhibitions programming. So one of the programs is what we call the Community Tech Jams. So it's a regular meeting where students, artists, and community get together for peer-to-peer learning and exchange in XR media and tools. So the Tech Jams serve as a multifunctional resource and collaborative practice for collaborative practice, team training, workshops, and meeting and working with other artists and organizations such as the Networked Imaginary Laboratory, Pulse Lab, the Sherman Center, and Factory Media Center. We work with each other to explore digital media and tools such as motion capture, immersive projection, and working with 360 cameras. World building with software such as Blender and Unreal Engine, as well as 3D scanning. And in addition to that, we explore digital assistive tech as media. So we also present our research at various conferences and to other organizations. And what I guess emerged from a lot of our community partners was they indicated to us that there's so many barriers for people and artists to engage with XR media. So what emerged from that was the idea and the co-development and design of a digital platform and mobile studio. And so the purpose for those aspects of our research is to provide a more accessible learning system and resources in digital media creation. It's also, the platform is also going to be used to hold a digital asset library and to develop a database of underrepresented artists working in XR. For the mobile lab, we want to support and increase the capacity of our collaborators and artist-run centers and community organizations, as well be a resource for the campus community, and do more outreach and have a pop-up exhibition facility. So, a lot of the platform and mobile studio are co-designed by the community stakeholders through multiple sessions that we've held over the last 3 years. We've also hired digital accessibility experts, and we spend a lot of time with a lot of people and the team developing guiding principles for ourselves and discussing the ethics of collecting data and data storage and artists' contributions to XR. So finally, exhibitions and events help to provide visibility and outreach for people interested in XR. They're a way of sharing and showcasing what is possible. These artist exhibitions encompass a range of technologies from collaborative projects to interactive installations and to digital remixes. So the series highlights how these artists push the boundaries of digital expression and engage with new technologies, offering a diverse and evolving perspective on the applications of digital media. The series is curated by Serena Walk, who is one of the RAs on the project, and everyone on the team and all of the partners in our partner organizations work really hard to support all of these exhibitions. Each presentation explores themes of care and technology, representations of space and identity, the relationships between body and the digital environment, and intergenerational connection through digital media. So students who participate in Tech Jams also have opportunities to showcase their work. This was an exhibition of their interactive work in VR, where audiences could log into the VR space and explore the virtual environments made by the students, either through computers or the VR headsets. The site was projected onto the big screen in the L.R. Wilson Concert Hall. And through our artist in residency program, the Real Asian showcased artists and the artists and their work at 401 Richmond in Toronto in conjunction with the festival. In addition, we co-hosted a symposium where multiple co-design sessions for the mobile studio and platform were housed. We're now in the third year of the project and have extended the project to the end of 2026. And in the spring, we're going to be going to Korea and presenting at the Isaiah Conference and working with Wusong University on the project. So our research activity to date is reflective of slow and considered relationship building to benefit collaborative and generative practice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carmela. Andrea, could you give us an overview, please? What you've been up to?
Okay, how's that looking?
Good.
Excellent. Okay, so I'll give an overview of work that I think is exemplary of what I consider to be the two sides of my research practice, and that'll like contextualize probably a lot of what I'll be discussing today. So there's the application of tech tools, which for me happens in research contexts as a core team member, co-creating digital works that are also, as Carmela said, pushing the boundaries of a lot of technological tools. And then the other core component in my work is studying the take-up of new technology, and not only in terms of societal growth and impact, but my work also considers how new technologies reinforce social inequities. So many years ago, when I was at Concordia University, I was a member of what was called the Mobile Digital Commons Network, and it brought together researchers from Concordia, York, OCAD, and at the time, the Banff New Media Institute. And together we were co-developing location-based mobile installations in various outdoor settings in Montreal and Toronto and Banff. And we were experimenting with pre-smartphone technology, if we can even imagine a time before smartphones. And so we were using phones, and these were phones that you could only call on or like text with, really minimal texting, like SMS texting. And we had these external like Bluetooth dongles and GPS devices, because these were not yet embedded in cell phones. And you know, the team included media artists, interaction designers, software engineers, communication and media studies researchers. And in addition to creating these installations, you know, we were really invested in understanding the implications of mobile technology. So how will these emerging technologies, again, this was pre-smartphone, impact how people communicate, relate, move through public spaces? What's the future of this technology when we combine commercial interests, so again, cell phone manufacturers, cell phone providers, with military technologies like GPS?
Hey, Andrea, can you
Yes.
hit swap display at the top? We're just seeing your notes
Oh,
and not the
well, that's not
slides.
helpful.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So this is documentation of an installation that I did at the Banff New Media Institute in 2006, and what I call as a research intervention. And I created, part of this was creating an analog walk and installation. And it was a tech-sponsored residency where artists were selected based on projects that they had pitched. And so the artists were there to create location-based installations. And again, this was using pre-cell phone technology. And it soon became really clear that the majority of the projects pitched could not be realized with the tech, but the sponsoring company was able to do some user testing, user test their hardware and software with the artists. in this context of the residency. So it was in raising some really important questions about, sponsorship in the media arts, and creating this installation was a way to document the experience of the artists. Also think through the technology at the time, which was like emerging digital technology in a more analog format, and in a way that audience members and the artists themselves could grapple with. So it was like trying to demonstrate and document all the labor and time that went into this work. When I was at the School of Interactive Arts and Technology at Simon Fraser, I was part of a team that was investigating the therapeutic uses of VR technology for chronic pain. And this involved a team of medical doctors, software engineers, user experience designers, media artists, to understand how virtual reality could be used to alleviate pain both during and after treatment for various conditions. And so again, this was sort of kind of pushing the bounds of the VR technology into novel domains. This project was a collaboration with my colleague, Mel Hogan, and this focused on documenting and synthesizing the materiality of the digital, right? So it was really about the life cycle of our technologies, what's often out of sight and out of mind. And so we adopted a digital storytelling format for this. And on the researcher side, we were really interested to understand the ways that people were dealing with or not their techno trash. And at the time, there were very few recycling programs. Now, of course, there are far more programs available. Like even within institutional settings, the only kind of, anything close to a tech recycling program would be for batteries. And so we were not really yet at that level of hardware waste collection. And on the participant side, the aim was to build an awareness of the life cycle of technology, and today I think this has been broadened to include questions of cloud computing and AI and the environmental impacts of our digital habits. So in the last 4 to 5 years, and this sort of brings us up to speed to what I'll be sharing more about today. In the last 4 or 5 years, my research has focused predominantly on cybersecurity. And like a lot of research, it started with a relatively mundane question, which is what's a data breach? And so one thread of this research studies the shift in language from computer virus to breach from about 2005 to 2021. And that shift in language from virus to breach also chronicles the evolution of technology. So we moved from desktop computing to ubiquitous cloud computing. But we also were interested in how language was used to describe a breach. So the terms that were used and the changes in the terms that were used to talk about victims or perpetrators, the breach itself, the implicated company or organization, and how this language also, in the way the language evolved to talk about and describe these things, came to define the data breach as a kind of crisis, a technological crisis. And of course, at the same time, thinking about the data breach as a crisis, right, as sort of this, as something extraordinary to the normal functioning of networks, promotes a kind of misconception that, all of that data, it's something like 2.5 quintillion bytes of data that's produced and generated daily through all of our various devices and the internet, is inherently manageable, governable, and controllable. And so, breaches are so common that the cybersecurity industry has coined the term breach fatigue to describe a kind of indifference that comes from an overwhelming and seemingly unresolvable series of events. And so this term might capture how some people understand and respond to this complex technological phenomenon, but it oversimplifies, I think, the emotional response, and it overlooks the very feelings people have when they're faced with data breaches. And so part of this research, there was very conventional outputs in terms of conference presentations, journal articles, but this question of how do people feel when confronted by data breaches, the research team decided to explore experimentally. And so we took all of the qualitative data and quantified it. And on one side of the screen, you can kind of see the scoring framework that was developed to do this. So we converted the words into numerical values, and then we fed this data into a program called Two-Tone to sonify the data. And it turned these numbers into sound. And so it was, a way to get back to that original question of how do people feel when confronted with breaches. And on this page is a link to where you can learn and listen more to that. In the last year, I've been partnering on a project with the Sex Workers Action Program in Hamilton. And this project documents and mobilizes knowledge about sex workers as experts with lived experiences and knowledge to reshape mainstream cybersecurity and safety. And it recognizes, it starts from the premise that members of the profession also become targets of invasive and unwanted surveillance, sometimes under the guise of security. So we're using zines to document the contextual cybersecurity risks and threats, and I'll be talking more about that project this evening. And then finally, these are two examples that were created with an RA over the summer, a media arts student, in consultation with SWAP. These were not produced as part of the research project, but offered a starting point to consider, what we wanted to do with the zines and how we wanted to work with them in these workshop settings. And so the first one looks at 4 important days in sex workers' labor rights. And the second one, called The History of the Internet Through Sex Work, aims to recuperate the history of the internet by illuminating 3 narrative threads. So one is that many of the pivotal innovations that led to the development of the commercial internet, as we know it, was often championed by sex workers and adult content creators, models, and performers. And second, in a bid to gain widespread legitimacy and acceptance to entice investors, the tech industry had to distance itself from adult entertainment while profiting off of the innovations in software and business models. And finally, it sort of brings us up to speed in this effort to sanitize the internet that started in the 1990s, that culminated more recently with the FOSTA-SESTA and the adoption of opaque practices like content moderation and shadow banning. And the argument here is that, a lot of these practices haven't made the internet necessarily safer. So I'll stop sharing now.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Andrea. So let's get to some questions. And I know the folks out there listening will be coming up with their own questions, which they can add to the list here. And hopefully we'll get to most of all of them by 8 o'clock. So my first question is for Carmela. There are some elements of the Sari-Sari exchange that you were just discussing that bring folks together to collaborate. Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience has been like, bringing emerging tech out into the public sphere?
Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, it's challenging because as I mentioned before, there's a lot of sort of barriers to entry in terms of engaging with a lot of emergent tech. So even with our students at Mac, sometimes a lot of their computers can't handle software and things that they would need to produce. So that just gets, compounded when you go out into the community and a lot of artist-run centers who are trying to help and facilitate studio environments for and diversify sort of people's ability to be able to communicate their ideas or tell their own stories. Oftentimes they can't support some of the media just because, again, everything is so accelerated these days, and then the cost barriers. And then on top of that, now we have to think really hard about the environmental implications of using a lot of this technology. So, I think part of what we've sort of been working out is that idea of shared resources to minimize some of that. Yeah, so yeah, it is challenging when you go out into the community. One of my other research projects was actually through Mira, and it happened during COVID, and it was to develop digital literacy resources for older adults, and we were just going prior to COVID, and then all of a sudden COVID hit, and we hit the ground running because we knew that these were things that people needed. So, it's the research goes sort of beyond, like, we can do our deep dives on research in tech, but also for our communities, what's relevant to them also really matters.
No, for certain. Okay, thanks. Andrea, your project kind of goes in a different direction in terms of, focusing on this analog approach and with the zines and such. So could you tell us about that? Like, how did you come to the conclusion that even though you were interested in issues of something like cybersecurity, the best method would be, to work in this analog, pre-digital method?
Sure, thanks. So coming off the data breach work that I briefly discussed, I wanted to look more broadly at cybersecurity. And in my experience, when I spoke with folks, even anecdotally, about cybersecurity, everyone I spoke with had very similar definitions of what it was, right? It sort of these measures taken to protect oneself, one's networks or devices from, unauthorized access or attack, some variation of that. And so people were quite savvy and understood the range of serious consequences that can come about from a cybersecurity incident. So at a very basic starting point, all of this is to say is that it's widely understood that we need robust measures to protect devices, networks, and critical infrastructures. But as I began doing some more preliminary research, and I read a lot of cybersecurity reports as well as educational materials, and I have to say the educational materials were quite good in the sense that they offered a lot of practical tips for protecting oneself, such as two-factor authentication, adopting password managers, tips on how to identify phishing emails. It was very educational and user-friendly. But during this process, I noticed the people impacted or potentially impacted were framed as generic end users experiencing the same risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. And so there was an implication there that if we practice good digital hygiene, which is the term used within the cybersecurity domain, that we're, again, to use the same language, we're bolstering that first line of defense and we'll stay safe. But coming from sort of the realm of critical technology studies, I started to think about and acknowledge that at the same time, security and safety they're not universal. We don't all experience safety and security in the same way. And there are distinct kinds and levels of security risks that are shaped by oppressions and privileges related to intersectional identities. So I wanted to take a step back from cybersecurity as this universal resource from which everyone benefits equally, to consider the cyber insecurities and threats that are not included in these frameworks, as well as how some of the unregistered insecurities and vulnerabilities connect to the experience of material security more broadly. So the tangible aspects of safety, and the provision of basic needs. So for those experiencing cyber insecurities and vulnerabilities not recognized within a mainstream cybersecurity framework, I was really curious to know as well as what are the mitigation strategies people are using to safeguard themselves. And so I've also been asked with really good reason, like why is this a cybersecurity issue? Like, why isn't this being framed as something more like tech facilitated violence? And in part, it's to open up how we understand and frame and also talk about cybersecurity more broadly, because safety and risk are almost always framed through individual choices where we're transferring responsibility to the end user. So you've either failed to protect yourself, you've done something wrong, we're a willing participant, or deserve the exploitation. So part of this project asks whether by reorganizing our thinking about cybersecurity to include the social aspects of insecurities and vulnerabilities alongside the technical ones, can we shift the balance in accountability? So given all these factors, it was really important to develop a research plan that foregrounded collaboration, cooperation, and community building. And this is where zines came into play. Last February, SWAP invited me to participate in 2 arts-based engagement events held at the YWCA. And these drop-in sessions sought to involve women and gender diverse individuals in collage making to share ideas for a safer use space at the Y. And so this project scales the activities from designing a safe use space to sharing these insights and experiences about cyber insecurities and vulnerabilities. So I started to wonder, what if within a similar context, what if we were to use similar arts-based strategies in the creation of zines that kind of document, not cyber security threats like in this universal way, but really contextual, that were coming through and emerging from the experiences of sex workers in Hamilton in a very local context. And so that, coupled with the fact there's also been a resurgence in the popularity of zines in the last 5 years. And I don't think zines were ever gone, but after being mainstreamed in the, mid to late 90s, and, they sort of dissipated after web-based forms of publishing, of self-publishing, really were taken up. So it's interesting to consider the rise in popularity of zine making. Like just yesterday, I saw a zine making, it was a session at an art camp for kids. So I think I think it's important to also ask, why zines now? And so the critical technology scholar in me wonders if it's in part a response to our dissatisfaction with social media platforms, or at least the kind of version, big text version of social media, because zines are social media. So, zines are a platform for communicating and representing the ideas and values and experiences of communities that are undervalued, or misrepresented in mainstream cultures. And zines have a specific relationship to networks and communities, in that sometimes the communities with which zines speak are anticipatory. So zines can create the communities and networks they wish to speak with. And zine making often happens in a shared space. So even if folks are working on individual zines, creators are physically together, talking, sharing. And so zine making is this embodied practice. It's communal, it's tactile, you're collaging instead of scrolling. And so I think, it fit the context really well. In short, that's sort of the long version of how I ended up coming to zines.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Thanks. And it connects back to what Carmela was saying, I think. So if I can come back to you, Carmela, both of you are working with underrepresented groups. Both of you are trying to, co-design and collaborate. So I would think another barrier is trust, right? You've got to have trust with the communities you're working with. So how do you both gain that trust and maintain it?
Yeah, that's also a very tricky thing to do in the community. You know, and a lot of us, especially in academia, are very much directed by institutional timelines, and our time is colonized basically. So, and the ways that in which we behave are directed by the institutions. So, and a lot of people not in the university, they have their own timelines, right? So you know, a lot of our research projects are usually a year turnover, right? And so and when you're working with community, I don't think they care really if you have a year timeline. And so it doesn't do any service to sort of rush the relationship, especially when you're trying to work with people and collectively generate information with and for each other. So for us, you know, we were really lucky to have this 3 year, and now we're extending it to 5. And we really need that time, because that time helps, it enables us to build that trust with each other, to get to know each other's like sort of boundaries and how we, you know, our respective approaches and perspectives. And all of that, those are just basic human relationship things that do require a lot of time. So, you know, that shouldn't be forgotten just because, you know, we're working through the university. And, you know, and also embracing our failures, and sometimes, you know, having the time to work through difficult issues or conflicts is really important. Again, if you're constrained in terms of your timeline, then you don't have time to follow through and really problem solve issues that might arise with community members and or other organizations. And they have their own agendas and their own sort of directives that they need to follow as well. So really, again, for us, the big advantage for this project has been the time.
Okay, right. Yeah, I can see that. And for you, Andrea, the model that you've described so well with respect to the zines and swap, can you imagine using a similar model for a different project or a different, you know, group of a different community group? Is it transferable, or do you really think this was, you know, most apt in this very particular situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, you know, this is an adaptable model that can, you know, capture, articulate and share like the observations and lived experiences across a range of social problems, right? That's part of the legacy of zines, which is challenging and subverting mainstream narratives while providing a space, you know, to share these, a space of self-expression to share these experiences. But I'd say, you know, if it's adapted, you know, that communities must remain at the core, at the center of any kind of take up of this model. You know, so even if I were to, if I was working with a different partner and repurposing this model, I wouldn't simply like, you know, replace the prompts. You know, instead I would still collaborate really closely with that community partner to ensure that like the approach is relative and sensitive to the community's needs and values and what they want, right? So I think any kind of repurposing of the workshop model reflects the realities and experiences of the people it aims to serve. So you know, that's me thinking as the researcher. But I also think, you know, if there were groups and organizations that wanted to adopt this model, you know, a version of it or variation of it for self-expression rather than research, I think that would be really fabulous as well.
Right. Yeah. Okay, great. And now, Carmela, I want to come back to something you said a minute ago, that, you know, this need for more time, and respecting the timelines of the community partners. You mentioned that one of the reasons sometimes you need more time is to redress mistakes made or just challenges that you weren't expecting, and trying to work through those. So could you give us maybe an example of, you know, one of the sort of road bumps you've hit, a challenge you faced? And while you're answering, I'm going to ask Andrea the same question so she can start thinking of one.
Yeah. Well, of course, let's see, there's so many, but I have to work through them. You know, one in particular that's been really challenging is trying to figure out, because we work with Tangled for Art and Disability, and there's really specific sort of needs and challenges that that Tangled sort of addresses with their community members and their membership. And so it is a huge learning curve for us to understand what those specific needs are. And we have learned so much from working with Sean Lee and the group at Tangled. It's humbling because, you know, I think a lot of us go in there very idealistic sometimes and want to just like help, you know, be inclusive and all the terms that we like to throw around. But the reality is, when you're on the ground with that, it's like within the disability community itself, it's so vast. And so we've learned that we can't address everything for everybody, but we have to work towards that, and work with the people who have the expertise in that, the people with the lived experience, and really take a back seat and just be supporters or facilitators, or help them, you know, sort of move their causes forward. So that's a big one. And just again, their timelines are very different from an academic timeline, or from another sort of community's timeline, or artist organization's timeline. So that has been really challenging, but really quite fruitful in terms of really understanding how to work with people. Yeah. I think the other thing that we do as a way to, again, sort of challenge sort of the status quo ways of working with other people, and like, instead of just having contracts or memorandums of understanding, we've developed what we call access riders, and that's with Tangled. And so these are living documents that that we update every few months to explicitly sort of indicate specific needs of different members of the team, or how they want to communicate, what the best methods are for meeting or communicating, and all of that kind of sort of really specific, I guess, stuff. I don't know. Yeah. So, yeah. So, I mean, that's, you know, one of the challenges. But, you know, as I mentioned before, like, people are people. So like, there's always going to be challenges.
Yep.
So, and I think it's a matter of us sort of changing our like reframing how we approach, I guess, working with other people in other communities, and really, you know, prioritizing other things other than sort of outputs and
right.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you. Could you come up with one, Andrea, while Carmela was speaking?
I came up with a few. Yeah.
No, sure.
Thank you. No, I think, and thank you, Carmela, because so much of what you said, I think, is reflected as well, you know, the tension between like institutional time or funding timelines, and community timelines, and finding ways of reconciling those different expectations, I think is a core challenge. And then also, you know, there are a lot of issues that come up or that are identified that significantly surpass, you know, the scope of the project, but are there in the research space. And so how do you allow those things to be brought in and to exist in a way that is meaningful and matters to your participants, while recognizing that in some ways as the researcher, you're a little bit out of your element. And I think this is where really strong, building a strong foundation with community partners really, really matters in those contexts. And so I've been really fortunate to, SWAP has been facilitating these workshops as well. And that's important, I think, for our participants and community members as well, because, a lot of people don't trust researchers for good reason.
Yeah.
And so I think, my role is to ensure that those relationships, that there's reciprocity in those relationships, that I'm very much aware of, the power dynamic. I feel like I'm being invited into a space, but I can never, hide the fact that, I've been called, oh, you're coming from the university, right? That it's very clear. And so it's negotiating all these things. And then really, I think just creating a space where participants not only feel, but they understand that they're valued, and that that I think is really paramount to this.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I want to get to some of our audience questions. Amazing questions coming in, and I don't want to run out of time. So the first one is for you, Carmela. So an audience member writes, can you please elaborate on the concept of data sovereignty and its importance in your research project?
Sure. Well, it's really like for us, we're thinking about sort of indigenous approaches, and part of data sovereignty is related to land sovereignty, and what we really appreciate about our indigenous communities is how they're quite interdisciplinary. So they're not just thinking about only tech or only water, or they really kind of think about how everything is an actor in a scene, and how they interact with each other, and all the implications that can emerge from all those interactions. So that for us it reminds us, when we think about data sovereignty, what are all the implications about using emergent technology? So one is, the impact on the environment. Using VR headsets, the amount of VR headsets that have been produced and the amount of resource they take from the land is astounding. And we're rethinking that as well. And how do we minimize the impact on our environment? So, for example, and then there's everything from security. So the idea of who owns information out there, especially when information that we generate, like culturally. So for us, our project is driven by an Asian diasporic team. So, oftentimes we look at the information that currently is sort of out there in, let's say, asset libraries. And if you type in Asian, your typical things sort of pop up, like dragons, right? And then they get appropriated. And so part of data sovereignty is also like, how do we safeguard but also share? It's a catch-22 all the time. But the main idea is that you have the autonomy and the voice to make those decisions, right? So that's also part of the idea of data sovereignty. And then how does that impact your representation? So again, everything is sort of like merges into each other, and you can't touch one thing without not touching the other. So I hope that answers your question.
That's terrific. Thank you. Now, I've got one also for Andrea. Andrea, can you elaborate, please, on how the concept of breach fatigue, which was a new concept to me tonight as well, so I'm interested in this too, how this concept of breach fatigue affects public response to data breaches?
That's a really good question. Whoever asked that, I thank you. So I think there's a few different ways to think about it. So I think that on a certain level, when we are inundated with the news of another data breach. I have a Google alert for any time there's a news story about a data breach. You can imagine what my inbox looks like on a daily basis. So on a certain level, like being inundated, I think can create a kind of fatigue, right? Where it's like, oh, another one, here's another one, here's another one. But at the same time, naming it as this kind of fatigue and suggesting that, well, people are just tired, right? People are tired about it. That is it naming a feeling or sentiment or expression that doesn't exist? Like, could it be more than fatigue? And I think that is where, I wanted to scratch the surface a little bit about, well, what is it about the fatigue? Is it being inundated with, these stories about data breaches? Is it sort of feeling kind of like helpless that we don't really know how to respond? Is it the fact that, we've sort of been conditioned into this kind of leap of faith model with technology that we just kind of be like, okay, sure, I'll sign up for this. It could go okay. Right. So I think I think fatigue is like a starting point to think of all the ways that we are, or possibly even sometimes not responding because we actually are not sure how to respond.
Yeah. All right, I think I've still got time for a couple more, and what I'm going to do in this next one for Carmela is to combine a couple that have come in. So one person has asked, how would you describe the audience that engages when you travel with your research to have these exhibits and events? So are they tech novices, tech enthusiasts, just art enthusiasts? Like, who's there? And then in conjunction with another audience member who wrote in, can you just give a sense of some of the themes and narratives that have come through these exhibits? So who's watching and what are they seeing, right?
Yeah, so typically, like in our tech jams, we have a mix of students from different faculties as well. There's some other tech jams that we've had in the community. So we've had a couple of them at Tangled Art and Disability. And so there's members of the deaf community, deaf or hard of hearing community that engage, and people that are low vision and low sight. So we actually, it's really interesting working again with such diverse perspectives, and it is really difficult to sort of workshop certain things like software. But what we've also gotten in return is like, I think I mentioned it, that someone was using an assistive device, digital device. It's an app called Seeing AI. And we started using that as a way to generate artwork. And it's, so it describes, so it can take a photo of things and it will describe what the camera sees. So the students started experimenting with, doing kind of a visual poetry, so laying objects down on the floor and then just scanning it. So in that case, what was really valuable to us was the idea that that you can use digital assistive tech as a media, and then it becomes somewhat accessible to some people because it's embedded in the artistic production of things. I think I kind of strayed off the question now, but it just got me thinking about that. Audience members, so yeah, students, different people, artists in the community that don't have access to a lot of digital tech, not just digital tech, but even computers that have enough processing power to run certain programs like Blender, which is a 3D modeling software, also does animation. So the idea is that, we're building the mobile lab so that it could be a facility that can help increase the capacity of some of our artist-run centers regionally, so that if they don't have the equipment or the tech, that the mobile hub can go over there and people can learn and use the tech in that space. As far as the exhibitions, I know I went really fast through them. But there was one person who created, with the help of one of our RAs, it's a parental apology generator, and so did this using a program called Python. So basically, he surveyed his family and friends and asked them, what is the apology that you would want from your parent if you could get one? And they created like a database. And then so you could sit at the computer and it would prompt you with a few questions and it would generate an apology and email it to you. And there was something really incredibly cathartic about that piece, because there's some people that were like very emotional and crying, and some people that, and yeah, there's just a really, like, we didn't anticipate that kind of response to that piece. So, and then there was another piece, this one's by Rhoda Medhat, who was originally from Kurdistan. And what he did is he used a 3D scanning app on his phone after we showed people how to 3D scan. And it turns out he was going to Kurdistan and he hadn't been there since he immigrated to Canada. And he was able to take a scan of his grandmother's trunk. It's like a traveling trunk. And so it talks about those ideas of migration or, movement, so he took a scan and then he did what was called UV unwrapped it and created a pattern, and then printed it on another fabric, and then cut it out and reassembled it as a fabric-based piece. So, and that's actually on exhibition at Center 3 right now, if you wanted to see it. But he's done some really, really interesting things. Like when he first came on board, he also explored AI in relationship to his Kurdish culture. And what was interesting is he prompted the AI to produce images of Kurdish people, and it started off sort of very abstract, and then it turned into more Middle Eastern people and then Indian people. So we could see that the AI at that time had a really hard time dealing with ethnicities outside of the Western, outside of Western culture. So that was pretty interesting. So, thinking back about what Andrea was talking about, sort of zines and things, the really interesting thing about artwork and producing artwork is that, especially when it's in a sort of collective environment, what happens naturally is just exchange and discussion. And so that seems to serve everyone, because people get so engaged in what they're doing and and they just automatically start communicating, kind of like free flow talking and thinking, right? So you get really honest conversations in those spaces as well. So
yeah, definitely. So we literally have 1 minute to go. So get your sort of speed caps on. I'm going to ask one last question, one brief answer from each of you. So what one piece of advice would you give to emerging artists or researchers or students who want to use technology to address social justice issues? Maybe Andrea, you go first quickly, and then we'll turn it over to Carmela before we wrap up.
Okay, very quick. I'd say to apply technology, not only in terms of what it is and what we can do with it now, but to test its limits in ways that enable us to understand what we can and should be doing with emerging technology.
Excellent.
And I'll piggyback off that and say, and to do it collaboratively, because tech is just too vast. And we've realized really quickly that there's just too many avenues, especially in this really accelerated environment, that no one can do it alone in a critical way. So
excellent. Perfect way to end. So with that, I'm going to bring us to a conclusion, and I want to thank Carmela and Andrea in particular for their time with us, and of course, Nina and Dave, who helped us get here tonight, and all of those of you in the audience. It was fascinating for me to hear about this research. I've been looking forward to this for a few weeks as we were getting ready, and I certainly look forward to future iterations of the Humanities Seminar series. So keep your eye, all audience members, on your inbox, because you'll be getting our survey that we always send after this to try to get some feedback on how we're doing. And please look for future Humanities Seminar Series invites. Have a good night, everybody. Bye-bye.